First John is about a church that's been affected, or churches that have been affected by some antichrists, some individuals that didn't believe in Jesus Christ. They were replacing him with a different kind of Jesus. They were denying that he was genuinely flesh or had been resurrected. And they also were denying his deity, the fact that he absolutely was God equal with the Father. And we're going to look at some statements here in 1 John 5 today. Statements in support of what John says here in 1 John 5 with regard to the deity of Jesus Christ. We've done this before, but it doesn't hurt us to come back to this idea. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're working verse by verse through 1 John. We looked in our last study at verse 8. It says, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three then are in agreement, or they are one. And so there was the testimony that the Spirit gave, and then the testimony that the Son indeed was deity, water, that he really did have this life. And lastly, and the testimony of blood, he really was physical. And so there was a genuineness in all of these things. And many of the things that Jesus did, he did by the Spirit of God. And we saw that in our last study. We saw in verse 9, if we receive then the testimony of men, if we welcome their witness, well, the testimony of God is greater. God is a greater witness than the witness that men would produce. And he says, for the testimony of God is this, that he has testified concerning his Son. In other words, he says, this is God's testimony. It's a greater testimony. And this testimony, and we're going to move into another section of this later, not today, but it says he has testified concerning his Son. And the one who believes in the Son of God has this testimony himself. That testimony has to do with having eternal life. But I want to go back and I want to look at some statements in which the Father gave testimony to who the Son was very briefly. Matthew chapter 3, this is when Jesus is baptized by John. And after being baptized, Matthew 3:16, you can see, after being baptized, Jesus came immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting upon him. So we saw that. That was part of the testimony that the Spirit bore. Verse 17, and behold, there was a voice out of the heavens that said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So there's an event in which many people who are coming to John to be baptized hear this, they see the Spirit descend like a dove. Doesn't say he is a dove, but he descends bodily like a dove would descend. If you've ever watched a dove or the way they come to the ground, this is the way they were watching the Spirit descend on Christ. And they hear this voice, the voice of God the Father speaking. If we move ahead to Matthew 17, we have this account in verse 1. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. That word transfigured means that outwardly he was showing what was an inward reality. He always was deity. He was this being that could manifest glory, but now visibly they're getting to see something with this. So he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. Could you imagine the intensity of that? The sun. And his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents or tabernacles here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen or hear him. Listen to him or hear him. Again, this is the Father. Before these 3 men, telling them on the mountain as they see this incredible visual display of the Son's glory. The Son's not glorifying himself. He's transfigured up here in this context. It says that he was, going back here, it says that he was transfigured. And that word transfigured that he uses over here is passive. Somebody else did this to him, which is, I would really say that this is the Father. The Son's not taking this himself. He's not just determining to all of a sudden I'm going to show you this visible bright aspect of my glory. It's rather that the Father glorifies him and then says, hey, listen to him. This is my beloved Son. In John chapter 10, or John chapter 12, excuse me, John chapter 12. This is just shortly before his arrest and crucifixion, but he's talking with a crowd and says, "Now my soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but it is for this purpose that I came to this hour." So in other words, Father, I'm not going to ask you to escape going to the cross. He is going to talk about a cup, and the cup is not the same thing as the hour. The cup has to do with part of how he faced the cross. But again, that's another study. So the Son never asks, "I don't want to go to the cross." That's why he came. But verse 28, and then he says, "Father, glorify your name." And then a voice came out of heaven, "I have both glorified it, and I will glorify it again." He's demonstrating something about the Father's name, the name of deity, showing something about the character of who these persons are. Now, one of the ways that this happens, if we go back to John chapter 5 and verse 36, Jesus is talking to these people because he has healed a man on the Sabbath, and they're very upset by all of this. And then he says in verse 36, "But the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John." He says, "John bore testimony, but I have a greater testimony, and that is the works which the Father has given to me to accomplish," or to complete. "The very works that I do testify about me, that the Father has sent me." In other words, the Father sent me, and he sent me with a job, and he gave me these works to do, these signs to do, this compassion to show people, to demonstrate that he really was sent from the Father. He just didn't take this upon himself. He was genuinely commissioned and sent by the Father. Now, this is talking about him in the realm of his humanity, but he's able to sometimes do these works by the work of the Spirit and sometimes by the exercise of his own divine power. But the Father sent him and gave works that testified. So when you read the Gospels, you're reading Jesus do these works, these miracles, these signs, and they're given to him from the Father to testify, not just to who Jesus is, but who he is because he's one sent by the Father. In fact, one of the things that he tells the people otherwise is, "I'm only doing what I've heard the Father say. I'm only saying these things. I'm only doing what I've seen the Father do," which means I'm doing what God can do, meaning I'm God. And they understood that. We don't get that. But the whole thing was none of them could see God. So none of them saw what God was doing. So for him to claim that he saw what God was doing and did those things, that was a claim that he was from God. We'll come back and look at that at another time. John chapter 10 then. This is during the winter feast, what we know today as the feast of Hanukkah. That's the way the Jews celebrate this. But in verse 24 of John 10, it says, "The Jews then gathered around him and were saying to him, 'How long will you keep us in suspense? How long will you hold our souls up?'" Which is their figure of speech going, "We're in suspense. You're holding, you're keeping us on edge. Tell us, are you the Christ? Tell us plainly." Jesus replied, "I told you, and you do not believe." In other words, I've already told you I'm the Christ. I do the works of the Christ. Search the Scriptures. They testify about me. I'm doing exactly what the Scriptures say. Aren't you reading? Aren't you watching? Aren't you listening? But they want one more chance. "Hey, tell us." He says, "The works that I do in my Father's name, these testify about me." And in other words, in the Father's name, keep in mind, when he says this in my Father's name, it doesn't say, "I'm healing you in the name of the Father. I'm healing you in the name of the Father. I'm casting out a demon in the name of the Father." That's not what it's doing. He's doing these authorized. That's by my Father's name. He's doing it with the authorization from the Father. He doesn't have to tell people continually over and over and over, "I'm doing these in the name of the Father." He has that authority. He was sent, as we just saw in John 5, from the Father. And he's doing the works that the Father gave him to do. And so he says, "The works that I do in my Father's name, these testify of me." He was sent from the Father, authorized by the Father, and now even though he's a man, he's doing these works. And these are ways that the Father bore testimony. He vocally bore testimony to Jesus Christ in those three scenarios that we saw. and in those scenarios, in one of them at least, in John chapter 12, when it happens, the people will look around and they go, it thundered. That's a good way for us to understand the way people understood the voice of God. Some of them think, oh, maybe it was an angel, but they don't really believe that this is God speaking on behalf of God the Son, because most of these people are unbelievers. They refuse to believe who Jesus Christ really is. And then on top of that, the Father sent the Son with works to accomplish, and he was doing those, and he says, those also bear witness to who I am. And so if we go back over there to 1 John chapter 5, it says here in verse 9 again, if we receive the testimony of men, we allow men to witness on behalf of things. He says the testimony of God is greater. What did God say 3 times? This is my beloved Son. This is my beloved Son. Or I have glorified and I will glorify. He had glorified his name because he'd given the Son works to do. The Son did those, and the Father was glorified by those works. But he goes, the testimony of God is this, that he has testified concerning his Son. He gave these works to do, to testify, and we're going to come back and look at this, that he was able, the Son is able, to give life. And we're going to come back and take a look at that idea of giving life as John wants us to see it and understand it here in the context of this letter. The Antichrist would have denied this, because they were Antichrist by replacing Christ with a different kind of Jesus that wasn't doing these kinds of things, wasn't sent from God, wasn't absolutely God in this way. And in this context here, it is testifying to the fact that Jesus is indeed the Christ, meaning he's the one that's resurrected and glorified, and he's also God and man in one. Keeping that in mind, this is the testimony then that we have received from God regarding Jesus Christ and regarding, now he's going to move into this, our relationship with him. Think of that. It's because of who Christ is that we have this relationship with God, that we have this eternal life. And he's going to come back, or we will come back, and look at what he continues to say to us in the following verses. Jesus is deity. If he's not deity, if he's not indeed the Son, meaning that he is absolutely God, not just a God from gods, but the God, that if we deny that, well, then we don't have eternal life. Because our eternal life depends on the fact that he is indeed not just a God, but the God. Trust that that's something that'll encourage you with regard to the eternal life that you as a believer in Jesus Christ actually possess right now. And in that, have a good day in the Lord, that you might be accessing that eternal life as you walk through the day. And as always, thank you for joining me.